Okay. I've got so many notes here, I've done lost myself. Okay. Shalini, can you call up the teaching? Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, write the maps. Okay. Okay, we're still in 1 Samuel, but I'm not in any particular passage of 1 Samuel. I'm jumping in and out, so I'm not even going to ask you to try and follow along the Bible. That might just get more frustrating than not. I think I'll start with this, though. I'm going to go past the maps here. Revelation chapter 2. I didn't write down the verse. I think it's either verse 16 or verse 17. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. Actually, I think I might have put that up there. Yeah. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. In some sense, we're all just sort of part of ourselves. We're just a part of who we are right now. You are promised a new name written on this mysterious white stone. You'll be given a new identity that will indeed entail who you are now, is part of who you are now. Indeed, I'd say it's latent within you. But the fullness of yourself has not been seen. Not by you, not by anyone, not by God yet. The fullness of yourself has not come into being. You will receive a new name. Indeed, sometimes in his ministry, his earthly ministry, Jesus gives people a new name, right? Peter, you are this rock. On this rock I'll build this church, and so on and so forth. He sees deep into you, and he sees that which in you which is strongest and which is best and which is that which is God made in you, and he's got a name for you with that characteristic, that, I don't know what, but he's got a name of which you know nothing, which I find exciting. I find 2 thumbs uppy. Yeah, I'll cross that one out later. But it is, if you reflect on it, this notion that you're sort of like a superhero. You have a secret identity that's going to come out, something that's beautiful and fully in keeping with who God would have you be. You know, I hope I don't arrive there and find out, yeah, your name is Fred. Like, oh, it's kind of disappointing. I thought it would be. But you have a name that is a part of who you are, of which you know nothing. And that person, part of that person is in you even now. I'm going to tie all this together in a minute. Matthew 7. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will. That's the part I'm going to be focusing on, the will of my Father who's in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, on the day of judgment, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you who do evil. This passage, of course, is intended to strike fear into the hearts of the religious, those who claim to know Jesus and call out, Lord, Lord, and who do things in his name but don't know the will of God. God still works in my life, you'll be pleased to know. God still does things that surprise me. There's a trick in magic. It's called, we watch Penn and Teller at night as a family, which is a magic show. Penn and Teller are famous magicians, and they have magicians who come on the show and try to fool them. It's called Fool Us, Penn and Teller. Anyway, there's a trick in magic called a forced pull or something like that, where a magician fans out a deck of cards and says, pull a card, any card, and he shows it to you and sees a random, and you pull the card. You think you've pulled a random card, but through any number of various tricksy ways, he or she knows which card you are going to pull. They know. And that's called a forced pull. So he or she knows it's going to be the 8 of hearts or whatever. And so a lot of magic is based on this. God did a forced pull on me this week, and so I'm calling him out on it. I was in the back in the kitchen after service on Sunday, and I was chatting casually, and Bob was back there, and Lori was back there. And how many of you have heard of the theologian and writer Watchman Nee? Bob, I know you have. But so we were back there talking, and I haven't heard of or thought of or haven't thought of Watchman Nee since seminary, since probably 2004 or so. I read a book of his called The Normal Christian Life, which I liked. I don't remember anything about it, but I remember I read it, and it has not been on my radar since. I just haven't read anything of his or thought about him or anything. And Lori mentioned that she'd been reading this book by Watchman Nee called The Spiritual Man, that she'd been enjoying it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And Bob was like, well, he's not my favorite, but I read him back a while ago, and I thought, well, that's interesting. It was one of those casual conversations that you have. And I didn't think anything of it. Fast forward a few days, I'm at Lincoln Square, because a series of unusual events. The library sent me to Lincoln Square to represent the library for the kindergarten registration thing. All the elementary schools there were to sign up kindergartners for school, and the library had a booth there, and I was manning the booth. And I realized about half hour into the event that this was going to be incredibly boring, and I had nothing to do. So I thought, I need a book. I need to be reading a book. And across the way was the Courage Connection resale store in Lincoln Square. And I know that they've got a bookstore section, a place of books. And you can always, in any used bookstore, by state law, you can always find a dog-eared Bible. Something, some Gideon or Catholic or Episcopal, you can find some Bible. You just do. And so I'll go get a Bible, I'll read some of Samuel and just kind of think about my sermon and get paid by your tax dollars. I felt good about that. So I went over there, and at the very least I thought there'll be some sort of devotional or something will be there. There's always some Christian spiritual thingy there, always. And there wasn't. I went through the whole bookstore area, and there just wasn't. There wasn't a Bible. There wasn't. It was a bunch of romances and sci-fi and crappy westerns and just a bunch of stuff. And there wasn't a single thing I wanted to read there. And I went through it twice, and I was like, I can't be it. There's nothing there. Well, guess what was there? The third time I went through, the only thing I could find, I was like, what is that? It's this 1960s looking purple cover. I didn't even really look at it very carefully. It didn't look that interesting. I looked closely. The Spiritual Man by Nee. I was like, oh, I get it. So that was literally the only thing there I could buy. It was a forced pull. I had no choice. If I was going to read anything of interest to me, I had to read Watchman Nee, and it had to be The Spiritual Man. So I thought, okay, God, I'm on to you now. So I picked out The Spiritual Man, which I've never read, and I flipped open this, which is volume 3, and the first thing I opened to, and actually I can prove it's the first thing I opened to because the spine is broken right at that page. So when you open it, it naturally opens up. In fact, the page is loose. So this is what God wanted me to read. Like he wasn't messing around. So I'm going to read it to you, because it related directly to what I was thinking about in terms of my sermon, and it put into words some things that more eloquently than I could have. And the language is pre-gender neutral, and so it talks about man's will, man's this. I'm not going to try and edit it in my head, just understand. He's talking about all of us, men and women together. So, part 9 of volume 3 of The Spiritual Man. A man's will is his organ for decision making. To want or not to want, to choose or not to choose are the typical operations of the will. It is his helm by which he sails upon the sea of life. In other words, how he or she steers. The will of a man can be taken as his real self, for it truthfully represents him. Its action is the action of the man. When we declare, I will, it is actually our volition. Volition is really just another word for will. It is actually our volition which wills. When we say, I want, I decide, again, it is our volition which wants and decides. Our volition acts for the entire man. Our emotion merely expresses how we feel, and our mind simply tells us what we think. But our will communicates what we want. Hence, it is the most influential component of our entire person. It is deeper than emotion and mind. So, in seeking spiritual growth, the believer must not neglect the volitional element in him. Many commit the error of treating religion as a matter of emotion. Boy, have I run into this a lot. Many commit the error of treating religion as a matter of emotion. They believe that it merely soothes and gladdens people's emotions, makes you feel better. Others insist that religion ought to be compatible with reason and not overly emotional. Only a kind of rational religion is acceptable to these, the religion of the mind. But what both of these groups do not know is that true religion, per se, does not aim at emotion or reason, but aims to impart life to man's spirit and to lead his will to be completely yielded to God's will. That's the part I really liked. That what true religion, what true faith, I would say, aims for is that your will would be completely yielded to God's will. Nothing to do with emotion or really, in a sense, even logic. Unless our religious experience produces in us a willing acceptance of the whole counsel of God, it is superficial. What can it profit a man if along his spiritual pathway the will exhibits no proper sign of grace, or if the will is not touched? True and perfect salvation saves man's will. Whatever is not sufficiently thorough to embrace the salvation of man's volition is vanity. All pleasant feelings and all lucid thoughts belong exclusively to the external realm. Man may experience joy, comfort, peace in believing God. He may understand His majesty and amass much wonderful knowledge about God. But does he possess any genuine union with Him if his will is not united with God's? I like that a lot. I like this notion of thinking about our will and God's will and where the two meet and how they should meet, or indeed, if they do meet in your heart and in your soul, the things that you want. One of the ways I like to think about this, and I know a few years ago I talked about this in another sermon. Eventually pastors repeat themselves, but I think it pertains so directly to this. If you think about yourself, or let me make it about me, why not? When I think about myself, so much of me is wrapped up in what I do, right? So, who am I? I'm a pastor. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son. I'm a brother. And I do things by virtue of all this stuff. Like, for example, as a brother, I'm going to have dinner with my sister. That's tonight, isn't it? That's tonight. We're going to have dinner with my sister tonight. This is how I remember my schedule. I put it in the sermons. So you may be a homeowner. So one of the things you do is you tend to your home. You know, you mow the lawn, you pay your taxes, and all these things. You know, all the full gamut of all the things that we do. And that tends to be how we define ourselves in large part. So it's a helpful exercise for me, and I commend it to you, to strip all that away from you. Well, what if I couldn't be a pastor? I'll start with my career. What if I couldn't work at the library? What if, well, I don't know, for health reasons or whatnot, I just couldn't do those things? And eventually, I assume, God willing, I'll retire and I won't do those things if I make it that far. I'm blessed enough. You know, what if I wasn't a father? What if you just start to strip these things away until you can't do anything. You know, you're not able to do much of anything. Then who are you at heart? What's left? What's left of Seth when there's nothing for me to do? My time at L'Arche was really instructive for me in this regard. L'Arche is a home for people with disabilities, developmental disabilities. Laura lived out there for 3 years in Seattle, and I worked out there for 3 months, which is about all I could handle, because I don't take care of people well. but it was really instructive to me. Because, of course, part of depending on how severe someone's disability is, there may not be much they can do in terms of what society expects people to do. They might just sort of exist. But then you find that part, that, like I said, that the white stone, that part, you find those God parts in them. That is why they are here. That is their delight and their blessing and their joy, and that they communicate to me. So it's helpful to think about having nothing to do, nothing, no calling, no nothing, but what is your will still? What is it that you want? What are the things of your heart that are deep down inside? That's who you are, your basic volition, your basic will. In fact, what you do can be very misleading, because you might do very good things, but for all the wrong reasons. And you might find yourself thinking to yourself, well, I know God. God's will and my will are one and the same. Look at all these wonderful things I'm doing, but they're not, actually. And this is where I'm going to turn back to Samuel. And, you know, there's a lot that I could talk about, but I'm going to talk again about Saul with regard to how the things he did many good things. If you read 1 Samuel 13 through 16, you know, he talks about him being valiant, talks about him being courageous, fighting the Philistines, the Amalekites, and all these pagan tribes with real courage, putting his life on the line to fight for God's people. He did good things, Saul did. But at key moments, his will would be revealed. And it would be revealed that Saul was not doing those good things for God, but for himself. And I just have a few examples here. I'll go to one of them we've already talked about, chapter 13, verses 7 through 12. Remember when so Saul's fighting this battle. Samuel's supposed to come and do the sacrifice, and Samuel's late, so Saul decides to do it himself. You know, he'll do all the things. So he'll do the sacrifice himself, which is what the priest is supposed to do. So that's one way that we can go astray, right? When our will is not in line with God's will, we take the roles that others have. We do things that other people should be doing because we need to do it all. Because we're the best at everything, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, and I will take care of everything because I am Saul. I am Seth. I will do all the things. That's a red flag that your will, over responsibility, that your will perhaps is not God's will. 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 24. They had just won this battle, and the Philistines had melted away, so to speak. They had scattered. But Saul tells the army to chase after them, in essence, and strike as many down as he can. You know, he's won the battle, but he wants to eliminate as many of these soldiers as he can. Now, in verse 24, now the Israelites were in distress because Saul had bound the people under an oath. They just fought a battle. You know, if you imagine how exhausting battles were back then. Battles are always exhausting, but these are physical battles. Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops could eat food, and they get quite hungry. There's a whole story associated with that, but I just want to focus. Cursed be anyone who eats anything before I have my vengeance on my enemies. Who's Saul doing this for? Saul's doing this for Saul, and his pride is on the line. He wants to be like the pagan kings. So with this one, we could draw out the lesson. Saul is requiring sacrifice and shows of piety from other people and from himself in ways that aren't for honoring God, but for honoring him. And so that's always a big red flag. When you feel like someone, it doesn't have to be a pastor, anyone, is requiring things that look really good, things that look like sacrifice, but you get the sense, and humans have a pretty good sixth sense, that we're trying to make a lot of ourselves and not a lot of God. It'd be like, you know, for example, at the food pantry, there are ways that we could talk about that would not be healthy. That would be like, look at how great we are. We're giving food to people who need it. Aren't we amazing? And it's so, you know, come to my church because we care about the poor, unlike those other churches. But I mean, you know what I mean. And it becomes about us. It's about what, you know, how we can look the best in the community. And that's always a danger. If you're human like I am, that can just sneak into you at unexpected moments, and suddenly you'll be like, oh wow, I really thinking pretty highly of myself. I've got a food pantry. So I try not to do that. But that's, Saul has no problem going there. It's about him, not about God. And finally, 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 9. And this was the big one. This, if you've gone ahead and read this, you'll know this was a very long and involved story. And parts are even kind of humorous when Samuel tells Saul to destroy the Amalekites, that's the word from the Lord he's had, and he's supposed to destroy them completely. That Hebrew word cherem, which you may have heard in other sermons, which means to devote everything to God, which means to destroy them completely. And Saul goes and he defeats the Amalekites, but he keeps the things he wants to keep. And specifically, he doesn't destroy the cattle, the sheep, and he keeps the things that he thinks will be good for his nation. Starting verse 9, but Saul and the army, remember that, spared Agag, that's the king, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was weak and despised they totally destroyed. And then skipping down to verse 12, early in the morning Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul's gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor. Saul has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. So keep in mind, Saul has done everything that God has commanded him to do with just a little bit, not quite, but he has destroyed the enemies of the Israelites. He's acted honorably in that regard, and he's acted courageously, but just not quite. He set up a monument in his own honor, and he's kept the best things for himself and his men, the cattle, the bounty. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you." Always good to start with a compliment. "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is the bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" So Samuel's like, I have eyes and ears. You know, I'm not that much of an idiot. You know, the Lord bless you. And Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle, and then he thinking quickly, to sacrifice to the Lord. Your God, he says, your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. That's actually the direct quote. But we totally did everything else. Enough, Samuel said to Saul. And then he goes on to say that the Lord is going to make you not king of Israel anymore, and he's going to search out somebody else who ends up being David. But, you know, Saul tries this whole, you know, the woman who was in the garden gave me the fruit thing. You know, like it wasn't me, it was these guys over here. You know, I didn't do it, they did it. And by the way, not only was it not me, but the whole reason they kept the cattle was they're going to sacrifice them at the temple in honor of God. In honor of your God. So my whole point in all this is that naturally Saul is doing the will of God, keeping a little bit for himself and also focusing on himself, bringing honor to himself instead of the Lord. And so again, these are things I think we can all relate to when our will trumps God's will, when we forget that this really is about serving the Lord and not serving ourselves. What can this look like? A million different ways. Not taking responsibility for your sins, or rationalizing things that you've done that you know are wrong, and you know before the Lord are wrong, but rationalizing it is, you know, well, God, there was this situation you may not understand, let me explain it to you. Or not fully comprehending the depth of your sin. Emphasis on your. People tend to have a pretty good grip on other people's sins. They understand the depth of sin in the world. Even non-believers have a pretty good handle on that. But the depth of your sin, this is what Saul can't quite get his head around. He still feels like he is literally head and shoulders above everybody else. The Bible tells us he was taller than most, but he feels spiritually head and shoulders above everybody else. Again, one of the dangers of being physically tall. Just slip that in there. So, who is Saul if he had no role? If Saul had never been king of Israel, who would Saul be? What if he had never even entered the Bible, just had remained another pastoral sheep herder or whatever he was beforehand, or he would have been the same person. But the power that he was given revealed his true heart. So let's look at a positive example and end with that. And even before you get to David, you have Jonathan. Jonathan sort of prefigures David. Jonathan is the son of Saul, but he seems to have a relationship with the Lord that is, Jonathan wants to know what God's will is and follow it. It's a real relationship. It's not just about bringing honor to himself. So if you go to chapter 14, verse 6, again, this is during a battle with the Philistines. I'm not going through all these stories in detail, but just trying to draw out these specific parts. So there's these cliffs. There's a pass, and there's these cliffs on both sides. And Jonathan and his armor bearer, kind of like sort of like a squire from medieval times, literally one who bears his armor. But armor bearers also fought alongside their masters, so they ended up being kind of a fighting unit. So Jonathan and his armor bearer are together, and at this battle, and there's two outposts, two Philistine outposts on either side. Starting in verse 6, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men," a derogatory term for the pagans, the Philistines. "Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." And his armor bearer says, "Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead. I'm with you heart and soul." He says, "Okay, let's do this." So they go. Jonathan said, "Come on, we'll cross over toward them and let them see us. And if they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' well, we'll stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. So they say, "Here we are." "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." So they start with a good insult, just like you would in any battle. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come on up, and we'll teach you a lesson." So they're mocking them and saying, "Hey, there's more of us than there are of you. Come on up. We would enjoy killing you." And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." And so indeed they go up and they kill about 20 men between the two of them. Now the part I want to focus on there is the very beginning in verse 6, where Jonathan says, "Come, let's go and do this." He says, "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf." Very key verse in terms of how Jonathan thinks about God. Saul is always trying to control God, whether it's with the ark or with his own actions. He's always trying to say, okay, God is going to be with us because of this, because of something I did. Jonathan says, perhaps God will do this, but that indicates perhaps he won't. Jonathan doesn't know whether or not God is going to give him victory or whether this is God's call on his life or anything. They're both pursuing the same ends. Both Saul and Jonathan are trying to defeat the Philistines, and both are being brave. But Jonathan has a certain humility with regard to God's will. And, it troubles me a lot in churches and in theological works I read, or just in interpersonal conversation, if I feel like I'm starting to speak to someone or hear about someone who always knows what God's will is and has there's no perhaps about their theology. That doesn't strike me as entirely biblical. That strikes me as quite unbiblical, actually. Sometimes we do know precisely what God's will is for us. We do. Sometimes God speaks to us very clearly. Frequently, as humans, we have to say, perhaps God will do this, like Jonathan. So he says, perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf, but then the next thing he says is the other half of that. He says, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving. So he says, I don't know if this is God's will or not, but I know that God can do whatever God wants to do. And that's the other side of it, that he doesn't have Saul's anxiety. Saul has incredible anxiety about whether or not he's going to win or lose any given, because he's out there on his own faith, doing it for himself. Jonathan doesn't have that same anxiety. He says, if God wants to do this, God will do it. And if God doesn't, then we won't. I'm not going to put you and me in that kind of danger. That's the left and right hand of will, our will. Our will should be one with God's will. That we all have the same mission, defeat the Philistines, or in this sense, we all have the same mission, which is to love your neighbor as yourself, to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to preach Christ to the nations. We share the mission, but we have to always have the will, the correct will, which is the will of God. And as humans, the way that looks is perhaps God will do this, perhaps he won't, but I know this, God's will be done. Whether, with me or without me, after I've passed away or now, it will be done. I'm not concerned about the final outcome. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 22 through 26, I'm not sure, did I put that up there? I did not. Okay, I'll just read it. Again, to do with will. Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments, because you know they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. And so, in this passage from 2 Timothy, there's the warning side of it. And that's part of why I put that passage up there at the beginning, which I just went right by. It's like the old Bob Dylan song, you got to serve somebody. Our will is going to be held captive to something. It's held captive to God, then our will is free. That's the paradox of submitting in absolute submission, the strongest words you can use, absolute slavery to God, total obedience to God. Therein, as humans, do we find our freedom. Because there's an infinite landscape of things you can do for a holy God. Whereas Satan, when you give your will to Satan and to evil things, the things you can do narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows until you're constrained and can't do anything. Indeed, that's sort of there's many things under that rubric, one of them being addiction, and that your life just narrows and narrows and narrows. But even outside of addiction, just giving your will to evil things, you'll start to shrink as a human being. When you give your will to God, it's you expand, you sort of explode into the universe in a positive way, because there's so many good things God has for you to do. But it is true. It is a difficult thing to hand over your will. As Watchman Nee said, we should pay attention to our volition and not tend to the things that we're doing. Pay no mind to what you are or are not doing, as much as to what will is driving it and what you want. What are your deepest wants? And I'm a human, I'm broken, I'm sinful, I've got all kinds of issues in my life, but I'll tell you one thing, I know that what I want most deeply is to be in the light of the Lord every day and for all eternity. That's what I want. And I know that I want that, and I see God using my volition, my will, to do good things out of that will. Yes, my sin is still there, and yes, I have my Saul moments, but they're Saul moments, they're not a Saul life. And so I commend to you that thinking and that taking reflection of yourself in that regard. I think I'll end there. I'm going to have Doug come up and read Scripture and pray us into our communion time.